Peter and the disciples have been out fishing. They haven't caught any fish. They're in the Sea of Galilee, and very unexpectedly, Jesus shows up.
Say the verse again.
John chapter 21. And so, I know that all of y'all have read this story probably many times. You've probably heard hundreds of sermons over it. But as we look at it this morning, once again, we need to try to really see it the way these men saw it and not the way we see it. And so follow along with me, chapter 21, starting in verse 1. Later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. Simon Peter said, "I'm going fishing." "We'll come too," they all said. So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" "No," they replied. Then he said, "Throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat and you'll get some." So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work, jumped into the water, headed to shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. Let's stop right there. Does this ring a bell with another story that's very similar to this in the Gospels that happened earlier? You remember? Pardon?
Feeding of 5,000.
That's one, but let's go back to this idea of catching fish and Peter. Remember the story when Jesus is first starting out and he sees Peter and Andrew, James and John fishing. And they hadn't caught any fish all night. And Jesus says this, "Throw your net on the other side of the boat." And so Peter says this, "We've worked hard all night, but caught nothing, but we'll do it anyway." So, against his better judgment as a skilled fisherman, he does what's said, and then they haul in a bunch of fish, and it says the net's almost broke. Peter at that point says this, "Get away from me, for I am a sinful man." Why would catching fish make this man think of his sinfulness?
So it was a miracle?
Pardon?
It was a miracle?
It was a miracle? Yeah, but it's a good miracle, right? It's not a miracle of judgment where lightning bolts come down from heaven and kill people. It's a good miracle.
What was your question again?
Here we go.
Think of it this way. If you got $1 million check in your post office box and you saw it was from John Smith, and then John Smith shows up later that day and says, "Hey, I'm John Smith," would you say, "Get away from me, I'm wicked"?
He knew that, isn't it the first time he met Jesus? And at that point he knew he was the Lord.
Okay.
His brother had told him before
Okay.
about him that he had found the Messiah. Am I
Yeah.
wrong?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because he was wrong, he was against what the Lord wanted him to do, and he flat out didn't want to do it when he did.
Okay.
Well, he had just heard a sermon from Jesus too, because the beginning of that is Jesus wants to talk to the crowd.
Mhm.
And he says, he gets in Peter's boat, and he says, "Take me out a little bit," so that his voice would
Yeah.
magnify.
Yeah.
So he just heard him speak. And because Peter said, "Because you say so, I will put the net on the other side." Even though he wasn't really following him at that point. So his faith was growing, and all of a sudden it hit him who this was.
Okay.
This was the Messiah.
Okay. I think there's some truth in everything y'all said. Okay. But now that you know that story, and we saw how Peter responded there, okay? The interesting thing in this story is when Peter realizes it's the Lord, instead of wanting to go the other way, he doesn't even just stand there and wait for the boat to go to shore. That's too slow. I'll jump in and swim. You know, in my younger years, I could swim pretty good, but I don't know that I could ever swim a bunch of guys rowing in a boat. But Peter evidently, instead of wanting to get away from Jesus, he says, I want to go toward Jesus. Okay? So, let's though think about this. Remember that Peter was the one that denied Christ, right? So Peter did that. Jesus is crucified, okay? And then in this story, we see that this is Jesus' third appearance to these guys. We know that one of the previous appearances was specifically for Thomas, right? When Jesus had to showed up before Thomas, the question on the table was Thomas's doubt, right? We're going to see here that this time when Jesus shows up to Peter, the question on the table is, what kind of relationship do Jesus and Peter have? Why is that important? Because let's just put it in human terms with the marriage. If I make a marriage vow and say, I will be committed to you till the day you die, and then less than a day later, I'm cheating on her and running off, that's kind of doesn't show much for the relationship, does it? Okay. Same thing with Peter. Okay. What we're going to see here, though, is that failure is never final. And if you just are willing to show up with Jesus, deal with the questions that he presents to you, then there's a future. And that's what we're going to see. Read with me again, starting in verse 10. So Jesus has breakfast waiting for them. He says, bring some of the fish you caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. Here is the deal. Jesus already has the food fixed. Right? That's what it says. But then Jesus gives them a command that to me doesn't make sense. Y'all go bring your fish and bring it. Okay? Why? It's Jesus' first statement that says, we're going to work together. It's not going to be just me doing it by myself and you sit and watch. You remember the feeding of the 5,000? When they said we just had the 2 fish and the little bit of loaves, Jesus did not say, you know what? You're right. That's not enough for all these people. Just put it back. He says, no, bring it to me. Okay? Once again, the common points here is that if you fail before the Lord, and we all do at one time or another, part of getting back on track is you bring the resources that you have. Here's the thing though, in the feeding of the 5,000, the resources were very meager for a huge crowd. Here it's flipped. 153 fish for about 8 people. The point is this. It doesn't matter whether you have a little or a lot. You bring what you got. It doesn't matter if you have a little or a lot, but you bring what you, that's a rhyme, isn't it? But you bring what you got. Write that down. I don't do this very often. Okay? But Jesus says, bring it. They could have said this. Why? You've already got the base covered, Jesus. They could have said this. We caught this fish. We drug them to shore. They belong to us. They could have gone any number of ways, which is what we do when God challenges us with our resources. They could have gone any number of ways, made any number of excuses, any rationale, okay? But they do what Jesus tells them to do. Because here's another thing. Right now, he's given them two commands. One, put your net over here. They obeyed. Two, bring what you got to me. They obeyed. From Peter's point of view, here's what I commend them for. When we fail, the easiest thing to do is to run off and hide, isn't it? When we fail, the natural tendency is I want to get in a dark closet, lock the door, and have nothing to do with God or anybody else, right? What we see here is Jesus is challenging them a step at a time, a step at a time. You already know the ending of this story, don't you? Right? Where Jesus is going to have the conversation, do you love me, blah, 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 blah. And then Jesus is going to tell him about his future, blah, 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 blah. You know the ending of the story, don't you? What does Peter know? He knows nothing of that. Here's the deal. When I fail and I come back to the Lord, I have to give up my wanting to know what the future holds. When we fail and we come back before the Lord, you have to surrender this natural inclination you have to say, well, where is it going to go now? What's going to happen now? Instead, like these disciples, you've got to take a step by step by step by step. But here's the good news. They didn't have to figure out what step to take. Jesus told them. What's my point? When you fail, you don't have to figure out the whole ballgame. All you have to do is to walk by the light you're given, to take the steps you're told to take. Okay? That's all you got to do. So, Jesus says, bring the fish. Now come and have some breakfast. Verse 12. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. This was the third time Jesus had appeared to his disciples since he'd been raised from the dead. They brought their resources, okay, and Jesus served them, okay. Verse 15, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord. Peter replied, excuse me, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord. Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. What doesn't come across here, and some of you may be aware of this, but I need to make this point clear in case you don't or are not aware of it, is that we know that in the Greek there are three words for love. Agape, unconditional love; phileo, relational friendship love; eros, sexual or physical love. Jesus is asking the question using the word agape. Peter is answering back with the word phileo. Why? Agape is total commitment, unconditional love. It's what you pledge to a spouse at the altar. I'll be committed to you till the day we die. Dial back to the upper room before Jesus was crucified, and what did Simon say? Though everybody deserts you, I will die with you. At that instant, at that time, Peter was saying, I agape you, Jesus. However, What did circumstances reveal?
That he didn't need
He really didn't. He didn't have it in him. Okay? He didn't have it in him. Okay? So, Jesus is basically, in these questions, wanting Simon to look in the mirror and admit who he really was. I can stand up here, okay, and you're going to get some kind of impression of me, and you're going to say, this is who we think Jimmy is. The truth of the matter is this. Am I willing to look in the mirror and admit who I really am? Are you willing to look in the mirror and admit who you really are? If Peter was around today and we had that upper room scene, it would be like all these people in that building over there that we're going to go into. We love Jesus, we'll do anything. Okay? Unfortunately, that's not always true. We use the term about a teenager sometime when we say this. He really doesn't know himself. What does that mean? It may mean that he really doesn't know what he really wants in life. He thinks he wants this, but he really, you know him well, he knows that. It can mean things like that. Say it, speak up.
It's not mature.
He's not mature. That's what she said.
Yeah.
He's not mature.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Jeremiah puts it this way. The heart is deceitful above all else. Who can know it? Back in the 70s, there were these two men that were on the forefront of the Christian counseling movement. What do I mean by that? Up till the 70s, when you talked about counseling or psychologists, it was strictly in the secular realm. But in the 70s, what happened in that field was you had these Christians who marketed themselves as, we're counselors, we're psychologists, but we're going to do it through the lens of Scripture. I happened to hear these guys being interviewed on the radio back then, and the interviewer said this: what's the most important Bible verse that you use in your counseling to people? And they responded back with that verse in Jeremiah. They said this: the key problem is when people come into our office, they don't know themselves. And he says it's our job to help them see who they really are. Because here's the deal: they cannot change till they see who they really are. So we have Peter here saying, I'm ready to die with Jesus. We have Jesus here saying, no, Peter, nothing's going to happen till you hold up that mirror and you are willing to admit who you really are. In this conversation here with Jesus, and Jesus doing it 3 times, Peter answering the same way 3 times, it's being made abundantly clear to Peter, hey Peter, this is who you really are. But I feel sorry for Peter. You know why? You got all these other men looking on. How humiliating is that? How humiliating is that? But we have to say this. When you read the gospel accounts, Mark makes it clear that when Peter said, I'm ready to die with you, all those other men that said the same thing. So here's what's happened when you put all the gospels together. They all said the same thing. Okay? Okay? However, Jesus zeroes in on Peter to get the point across. So if you're these men that are watching this and they're not saying a word, which I wouldn't either. It's like, I hope he doesn't call on me. You know, hope he doesn't ask me what I think. You're sitting there, you're not judging Peter because you know you've done the same thing. Any scandal that you've read about with any big name preacher that's made the front pages, I will sit here and say Jimmy Fuson could do that. I know Jimmy Fuson well enough after 50 years of walking with the Lord, I could do the same thing. It just would not be publicized because I'm not famous. Thank God. I have the same potential. That's what these men had to realize and see. Because here's the deal. If they were so arrogant and prideful and blind to themselves, they would have jumped in right there and said, I'm not like Peter. No, they kept their lips buttoned. So Jesus confronts Peter with the devotion, the spiritual power, the commitment that he thought he had. He really doesn't have it. And you know what I like about Peter? He does not defend himself. He does not say, Jesus, look, Romans had you by the throat. I can see where this is headed. Can you really blame me for wanting to run out and save my own hide? He doesn't defend himself. He makes no excuses. He makes no rationalizations. You know who he reminds me of? When Nathan confronted David after his sin with Uriah, murdering Uriah, and Nathan said, you are the man. You know what David said? You got to understand, Bathsheba is pretty hot. You got to understand, all the kings were doing this, which they were. You know, what was David's statement? Well, it wasn't I've sinned against Uriah. It wasn't I've sinned against Bathsheba. It's I've sinned against the Lord. Peter, like David, had the humility to call a spade a spade. I don't care what you've done. I don't care what you might do. I don't care what your kids or grandkids have done. When Jesus confronts them or confronts you, if you are willing to call a spade, Jesus says, I can take it from there. I can take it from there. But if you hem and haw, rationalize, defend, get mad, run the other way and hide in the closet, nothing happens. Peter made the right, for whatever wrong choices he made, just basically in the chronology, just a few short days ago, he at least did the right thing there. But in the gentleness and kindness of Jesus, Jesus used perfect timing. Okay? He had already appeared to Thomas in the room with the disciples. We all know that Peter was one of the first ones to go to the tomb. Okay? And unlike Thomas, Peter had the faith to really believe Jesus was Jesus and the Messiah. He didn't demand the proof that Thomas did. Okay? What am I saying about all this? Jesus didn't storm in to Peter right after he rose from the dead and confront him then. If I was Jesus, I would have been pissed off that this guy committed and said, I'm going to defend you to death, and then deserted me. Because when you're betrayed, you're angry, or you're not. Jesus waited till the right time. But here's what Jesus also did. He used an event from Peter's past to get his attention. And that's where the fish and the net and throwing the note on the other side of the boat. What's my point here? Sometimes when we have turned a deaf ear to the Lord and we ventured all the path, one of the things he does, he says, let me take you back to a time when things were good. Let me take you back to the way it was when things were good. Let's go from there. Let's have another story like that. In other words, he doesn't go to Peter and just drop the hammer on him. Okay? He wants to let Peter know, I'm showing up now, but I have good intentions for you. And the way you know that I really love you is I'm going to repeat a miracle from your past. Is that not grace? Jesus said, I'm going to do something good before I bring the bad news.
Jimmy, I think, looking at this, I think Jesus is also giving Peter 3 commands. Number 1, feed my lambs.
Mm-hmm.
Small sheep, young sheep. Number 2, tend my sheep, help them grow. And then when he gives us number 3, he says, feed my sheep. So what he's trying to do is, in my opinion anyway, is getting Peter to realize he's got these baby sheep here.
Mm-hmm.
He's got the young Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Tend to them, bring them up until they're adult Christians, so they can spread the news.
Mm-hmm. Right. The other thing, though, another aspect of this, from Peter's point of this, is this. When we fail, we feel useless.
Exactly.
Do we not?
Yes.
When we fail, we feel useless. Jesus here, in this conversation about loving him, okay, and talking about feeding sheep, Jesus really accomplishes 2 things in one. On the one hand, the conversation shows Peter where he failed, and it's undeniable. But on the other hand, Jesus is putting a Band-Aid on the wound because he's saying, you're still very useful to me. I still have a program for you. I still have a plan for you. In other words, Jesus could have just said, do you love me? And Peter said, I love you. And they could have just had that. Christ interjects the feeding to really get at the root of human nature here in 2 ways. Peter, you need to admit who you really are. But Peter, you need to see this, that even though you are who you are, I have a job for you. That's what we have trouble. We may have the humility to understand our failure of devotion. But our conclusion, the normal human conclusion, is when you have failed, the show is over. Right? Jesus here in one fell swoop is saying, yes, there's a problem here, but the show is not over. In other words, Jesus wants us to admit where we are, but he does not leave us there in shame. We have to be honest before the Lord, but we are not left there just in shame with no future. And what else is implied with this is this. Peter, this is what you did, but our relationship is not irretrievably broken. If it was, I would just pronounce you guilty and walk off. So all that's wrapped up here. Verse 19. We'll pick it up in 18. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself, went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands. Others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to let him know what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, follow me. Dialed back to the first time that we referred to when Jesus called the disciples and they had that deal with the net, was breaking with the fish. There it said, the text says that they left their nets and followed him. Once again, Jesus goes back, I think, in a very specific reminder to that time, okay? And he says here, follow me. A more literal rendering of it here is not follow me, because that implies a once-for-all decision. The actual more literal translation of this would be keep following me. There's a difference. There's a difference. So, if you're Peter, here's what's going through your mind. I remember the first time he did this miracle. I remember I felt sinful then, but Jesus says, follow. He says, don't. Back in that first instance, what I didn't tell you was that Jesus said, do not fear, from now on you'll be catching men. What's my point? The first encounter that Jesus had with the miracle of the fish, Peter said, I'm a sinful man, get away. Jesus didn't say to him, no, you're not sinful, follow me. He didn't say that. He said, do not fear, follow me. What's the difference? Jesus did not refute Simon's self-assessment at the first time. He did not say, no, you really, in our society today, with self-esteem issues on every corner, we'd say, oh, feel good about yourself, you're not bad. Jesus didn't say that. What did he say about do not fear? Don't let your fear of your inadequacy stop you. Follow me. He did not say, Peter, you're right, you're sinful. When you get better, come follow me. He gave him an immediate command, follow me as you are today, with that self-assessment. So now we come up to this current story, and you're Peter, and Jesus has had this conversation with you about do you love me? Okay, da-da-da-da-da. And then Jesus says, keep following me. What we see here is that Jesus, through all these little nuances that I've been trying to lay out, he is trying to coax Peter into taking the next step. He's trying to tell Peter our relationship is okay. The reason our relationship is okay is not because you are so good, but because you are so honest. Our relationship is not so good because you are so good. It's so good because you are so honest. And then he has this conversation about feeding of the sheep. Okay? So Peter, whatever the answer is to your failure, it's not hiding. The answer to your failure is not hiding. I've still got a job, okay? And then he says this, he caps it off, keep following me. How could Jesus make it any more clear? Here is the problem that you and I have when we fail. We want to hide, but we also jump to this conclusion that if we're going to come back, it's going to be some sort of real complicated steps we have to kind of figure out. No. Jesus takes him back to square one. Peter, when you were aware of your failure 3 years ago, the answer was just to follow me. Peter, now that you're aware of your failure now, the answer is just to follow me. What's my point? When you fail, don't get lost in the fog. Don't make it more complicated than it is. And in fact, if you really want to drill down to it, do what you've always done. Keep following. Do what you've always done. Keep following. We tend to go off on these other trails, okay? Our guilt drives us there. Our shame drives us there. We come to the wrong conclusions.
We're trying to fix it ourselves.
You're saying it's a football game. You carry the ball on the first down, you get hit, you lose. Second down,
Yeah, right.
ride the ball.
Right.
Fall back to and fun.
Right.
Well, what I like about this is, as you pointed out, it's restoration. We don't understand the fact that, we failed, and our look in the mirror, but he restores us. And that's the beauty of it. As a kid, my mother, I was always grounding us for this, that, and whatever. My uncle said, oh, you got life at 16 or something. Well, I did one time, I don't know, who knows when I did or didn't. And I couldn't go to dance or something. And so my mother said to me, well, how come you aren't going to the prom or dance or whatever it was? And I said, well, because you grounded me. She said, because you told the truth, you can go.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And she was like that. My mother was very,
Yeah.
but when it came to telling the truth, I know it's not exactly the same, but it
Yeah.
just made me think
Sure.
that. But yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. And I always remember that. You tell her the truth, you're going to get dealt with in a different way than if you lie. Like she knew everything.
Yeah.
So it's second down.
Right. So, I want to ask you this. What is the biggest test of faith you've ever had?
How can you weed them out?
You've had a number of them, right? We tend to think of a test of faith, though, in this
Two
one.
top 10.
I need a bunch of money, so I'm praying hard, and at the last minute I get the money. Great ending to a great story. Maybe it's some kind of health issue, and you pray, and maybe some people fast, and you get better. Great ending to a great story. Okay. I submit to you that one of your biggest tests of faith will happen when you fail. And what I mean by that is not that you failed, but what do you do with it? Because I think sometimes our biggest test of faith is believing that God can deal with the failure. Sometimes our biggest test of faith can be with believing that God can deal with the failure. Let's drill a little deeper. If we were talking about a test of faith, say being something to do with money, what really are we zeroing in there? Is God really omnipotent? Well, let's talk about God's omniscience. Sometimes you can look back and you can see, oh, God knew that all along. And so that gives you a new appreciation of his omniscience. What's the issue on the table, though, when the test of faith has to do with forgiveness? Does he really love me enough to forgive me? Is he really a God of grace or a God of judgment? That's what's under the microscope when we fail. That's the attribute of God that's under the microscope when we fail. It's not his omnipotence. It's not his omniscience. In fact, if you think about his omniscience, that's what makes you feel ashamed. He knows it. He knows what I did. I've been found out. I've been outed. Right? You're convinced he's omniscient. No problem there. What's the issue on the table? Is his grace. And I've realized this in my life. I can do a lot of things to offend God. Right? I can do a lot of things to offend God. But I think from God's point of view, if I struggle with the forgiveness of God, God's sitting there and he's scratching his head. He said, Jimmy, I understand, the money stuff and all this. But Jimmy, there's this cross over here. How can I make it any clearer than that? That everything's okay? How can I make it any clearer than that? There's a lot of things we have to believe God for, and it says we walk by faith, not by sight. Right? We walk by faith, not by sight. But you know what? When it comes to the forgiveness that God extends, I walk by sight, not by faith. Why? It's because the cross was a visible event that human eyeballs could see. It required, in a sense, no faith at all. Just look. Seeing should be believing, right? We say, if I saw it, I believe it, right? Did Peter see the cross? Peter saw the cross, okay? But here's the deal. Jesus in this conversation said, look, Peter, I don't want you just to see it. I want you to believe it. Okay? And that's what I'll put in.
I can understand that, and I can accept that, and I believe that.
Mhm.
But I have a hard time forgiving myself for many of
Yes.
my, even though I know it's there. If
Speak
you're
up.
getting ready-
Speak up.
I have a hard time.
Speak up.
Certain things, decision. I have a difficult time forgiving myself. I
That-
know he forgives me.
Yes, that is the problem. Jesus would say, Jimmy, if you want to beat yourself up over the head, go ahead. I forgive you, and I don't know how to make it any clearer than that.
Who do you think you are?
Right.
You think you're God?
Yes. And so all of that's wrapped up in this. But what we need to see is how Jesus makes it so personal, using Peter's past, using fish, nets, boats, things that he's familiar with. Jesus, what's Jesus doing? He's saying, look, Peter, the story of the cross is for the world, but I want to make it real to you. I want to make it real to you. Sometimes, here's the irony of it. It's a lot easier for me to tell the serial killer he's forgiven than it is for me to tell myself I may be forgiven for cheating on my income tax. Right? This speech is this. Sometimes I realize this. The speech I would give to others about God's grace, I need to give to myself.
Yeah.
I need to give it to myself. And so all that's wrapped up in here. But Jesus, being who he is, he puts a little bit of a sharp edge on it. When he talks about how you used to dress yourself, da-da-da-da-da. When I moved to Florida and I realized Florida is all about old people and retiring, I did not have any real estate people selling houses or financial advisors saying, Jimmy, when you lived in Colorado, you went wherever you wanted, did whatever you want. But when you come to Florida, you have a miserable old age. Somebody's going to lead you through a rest home. How did this hit Peter? How did it hit you?
How, what'd you say? How did you what?
If Jesus gives this speech to you about your old age, which is what he told to Peter, and we're all old people, okay?
Speak for yourself.
How would this, if Jesus gave you this speech, how would it hit you? That when you're old, you're going to lose all the things you used to control. When you're old, you're going to lose control of all the things that you used to be autonomous in. How would that hit you?
It hits every day. We got some stuff that needs to go up in the attic. I need to go up the stairs. So my kids are gonna have to come over and put the stuff in.
This is a sharp edge to me. Because here's
Jesus talking.
here's the deal. Here's the way I would expect this story to go. Jesus has made these great statements to Peter about how everything's good. Da, 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 da. I have this plan for you. Let's hug and live happily ever after. No, Jesus takes a bucket of cold water, throws it in his face, and says, well, now that we've gotten to this point, you got to understand your old age ain't going to be what you dreamed of. Just letting you know, Peter. Now, what's Peter going to do? He's going to do what all of us would do.
What about him?
What about him? Peter looks around, sees John. What about him? When God's sovereignty that we've been talking about the last several Sundays in the life of Jesus, now that same sovereignty shows up here. Jesus doesn't just show up with grace. He shows up with the sovereignty of God. What do I mean by that? Because the sovereignty of God means that your life will not look exactly like my life. The sovereignty of God is this idea that God has a plan, and it's God's plan. It's not ours, and it's not going to look the same for everybody, right? And that's what basically Jesus is saying. Those orders that I gave you about feeding the sheep, okay, those are not suggestions. Those are not, well, Peter, when you get old, you know, you get tired of playing golf, teach a Bible study at the church. No. He gave him very clear commands. And not only this, he gave them basically the same command 3 times. What's my point? Jesus is very clear in this speech. Peter, our relationship is good. What's equally clear is I'm giving you an order. I don't just welcome you back. I give you your marching orders. And then Peter, like me, he kind of chokes and gasps. Well, what about this guy over here? I mean, are we all going to suffer together? Nothing makes me happier when I'm miserable to know that she's miserable too. Misery loves company, right? Don't we all say misery loves company?
Yes.
Right? Misery loves company.
Yeah.
And Peter is typifying that. If I want to be miserable, these guys need to be miserable right along with me. Peter slaps him basically in the face. Says, that's basically none of your business, bud. Right? That's the way it reads, does it not?
Yes.
What he doesn't do is shed a little light on John. Here's what he does say. Well, Peter, you gotta understand something about John. Yes. What's going to happen to him, he's going to be exiled on the Isle of Patmos when he's an old man. Remember the story of John? Remember the story of John? He's going to be exiled on the Isle of Patmos. Jesus could have said that, and Peter would have said, okay, I feel better now. Right? What else is going to happen? One of the people that's here is James. Do you remember what happened with James and Peter in prison in Acts? Anybody remember?
James was beheaded?
Speaking, yeah. James was killed. What did Peter have? The story reads in Acts that an angel showed up, kicked open the prison cell doors, and said, Peter, get your coat and follow me. So, Peter, though, at this point, knows none of that. He knows none of that. All he knows is this. The relationship's good. I'm forgiven. I've got a job. My future don't look that great. And who knows what's going to happen to this guy? That's all Peter knows. So, I just said 5 minutes ago, we don't always walk by faith. We can walk by sight. There is the cross to see. Right? Now the coin gets flipped over and Peter has to make up his mind he's willing to walk by faith. Right? Here's my point in summing it up. The sovereignty of God has all these different facets to it. Okay? Sometimes we get a glimpse of it, we understand it, we like it, we accept it, and we go on. But on other days, it's nothing but bad news, a difficult future. The sovereignty of God is something everyone in this room believes in. The sovereignty of God is something that everyone in this room struggles to accept. There's a difference. I can believe that there's life on Mars, but I accept it by actually choosing to go there. So, all of this is wrapped up with what Jesus is doing with Peter. What I've learned is this. When I'm struggling with the sovereignty of God, it's not going to just involve one category of life, although I may see it that way. I've learned that I need to look at it through several layers of my life. Okay? Because actually God is working all those layers simultaneously. We tend to compartmentalize it. But really, from God's point of view, He's working all those layers simultaneously. Because we see this with Peter, we see the relationship he had with Christ. We see the job that Jesus had for him. We see Peter having to accept it, even though it was not the same as everybody else's. Okay? And what we don't see here, who's Peter's brother? Andrew. And when you look at Scripture, it's hard to find any information out about it. What's my point? Sometimes the sovereignty of God will take you in a whole different trajectory from your family members. Sometimes that trajectory will separate parents from children or grandchildren, brothers from sisters. The sovereignty of God sometimes it does all of that. And we're given no explanation. But what I want you to see this morning is you're not alone. It's all right here. And your choices and my choices are the same as these people's choices. Peter had to admit how he really was not all that devoted to Christ, how his devotion was limited. How do we figure out our limit? By confronting our biggest fear. Because what was the reason Peter failed in the first place? Fear, right? He thought he was going to get killed too. I would submit to you this. If you really want to know how devoted you are, whatever you're the most afraid of, dig it out of the closet and look at it. That's how I really know who I am. Not by doing what I'm doing right now, but by asking myself, when I'm all alone, what are you the most afraid of losing, Jimmy? That will be where you find the limit of your faith. Let's pray. Father, I just ask that as we muddle along, struggle along, sometimes we go backwards, many times we go sideways. I pray that you would help us to never forget that we do have a good shepherd that goes looking for the sheep, that laid down his life for the sheep, that protects the sheep, that guides the sheep, that forgives the sheep, that leads the sheep. Help us to truly believe that you are who you say you are. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
That's why we have